Hello, and welcome to this art camp video. Today we are creating sun-shaped flower watercolor paintings. So you will need some watercolor paper or some heavier paper if you have it, watercolor pencils, watercolor paints, of course a paintbrush or two, and water. So if you don't have any of those things, you can improvise and use what you've got at home. This is all for fun. We are going to start by drawing the sunflower. I am using watercolor pencil crayons, but you can use regular pencil crayons if that's what you have. So I start with a circle in brown in the middle. I added little bumps around the circle, but that's totally optional. So I did my brown circle with my little tiny bumps around the outside. And then I'm going to make 4 lines coming out of the flower center. These will be at north, south, east, and west. Try to space them out as equally as possible. Next, I'm going to take orange to outline my petals. Because it is a sunflower, these petals are thin, tall, and have a little bit of a point at the end. Just like that. I try to make them about the same size, but they do not have to be perfect. Then I take a yellow pencil crayon or pencil crayon watercolor, and I go around my petals just inside of the orange line and add a little bit of yellow to them. Next, I make lines in between each petal. Again, as equally as I can. These lines are opposite of each other. And then I take my orange pencil crayon and I put those same shaped petals. They do not all have to be the same or perfect. Use your best judgment. And then, of course, the next step is to color around the edges with a yellow pencil crayon. This one is a pencil crayon watercolor, but again, whatever you have at home. And I spend some time just darkening the edges and making my petals stand out a bit. This will help later when we get to the blending stage. Now, in between these, there are more petals. So in between each petal, add a line in the middle as best as you can, eyeball it. Try to make them about the same length. The thing that's different about this row of petals is they are peeking out from behind the other ones. So take your orange pencil crayon and draw one that's kind of behind. So it comes out from behind the other petals, because the back row of petals on a sunflower is a little bit hidden. Then again, I'm going around with the yellow. And since this one's a watercolor, I'm not being too crazy on how neat it is because it's going to melt anyway. Now it's time for the water. You will notice I am using a very tiny brush here. This helps me control just how much water I put on the petals. I'm also not putting water on petals that are right next to each other because it's easier to work with the paint when it's not running in between the petals. So once it dries, you can do the petals next to them. So I'm starting with my first 4. And so what I do is I put water on it, and I use the smallest brush I can because you don't want too much water and you don't want not enough water. So using a tiny brush will help you get it right. Now you can see I'm doing a wet on wet technique here, and I'm adding some dark yellow around the outside of my petals. So you can see how I'm adding, this is from my paint palette. This is watercolor paint, and I'm just putting some paint on my tiny brush. You can use a slightly bigger one for this part. And I'm adding it to exactly where I want it on the petal. So I'm using my eyes. I'm looking what looks good to me. It might look different for you, but what looks good to me, I like to put some around the outside of my petals. And then I start working on the petals in between those 4. Because remember, we don't want to work on petals right next to each other when they're both wet. You'll just make a mess and you'll frustrate yourself. So I start by flooding just the right amount of water, and that's different for every artist, onto my pencil crayon watercolors. Each petal, I'm filling up the whole petal, and then I take a little bit of yellow paint on my brush and I move it around in the water. Because the petal is soaking wet, the watercolors slide around on it and you can play with them. You can move the color to where you want it. Remember, you can always use a tissue to pick up the color if you've got color where you don't want it. Play around with this. So you're trying to discover your own creative joy and your own creative style. And how you do that is you play, you experiment. So this is me experimenting. Try different amounts of water, try different brush sizes, find what works for you because everyone's different. So just to note, this is sped up about 20 times faster than how I was actually working. You don't need to rush through this. Take your time, put on some good music, and take a break when you get to the point where you need to work on the petals in between, like I am here. I let my paper dry for a while. And just work with playing with the amount of water. On these ones, I use a slightly darker shade of yellow. It doesn't really show up on the camera, but I did. In the in-betweeners, I mixed a tiny bit of orange in with my yellow because they're behind and the light hits them a little differently. So very subtly, again, that's something to play with. How much orange do you want to mix in with your yellow? How does that change your paint and your flower? Maybe you want to try a different color altogether. All right, so the last step in the painting of the petals is to start to add a little bit of a darker orange. I like to do it just on the tips of the petals, but you could also do some yellowy orange stripes down the petals too. So just a little bit of stripes, and I'm doing that, working from the tip and moving toward the middle of the petal. I just do little stripes, very subtle stripes, just like the veins in a sunflower petal. So play around with this until it looks good to you. Remember, adding darker colors, such as a yellowy orange, is going to help you show where the shadow is. The bright spots are where I imagine the sun is hitting strongest. Okay, here I spent a little bit of time coloring in the center. Now, I totally should have used a bigger brush for this. This looks painful to watch. So you do not need to use a tiny brush for this part. I think I just had what I had and I kept going with it. So if you have a bigger brush, definitely switch up to that if it seems right. So here I'm blending brown with a little bit of green and a little bit of lighter brown. Remember my rule from another paint video that you want to try and have lots of colors on each part of your painting. And this is definitely, especially when you're working with browns and greens, that's really fun to work with. So play around with that. Then I color in my little bumps on the outside of the center of the flower, and I add little hairs. You could do that with a pencil crayon, just little tiny ticks of hair. And you can see here how when I'm mixing my color with my entirely too tiny brush, I like to mix it into the palette. And then before I did the stem, I tried to mix some browns and some greens and some yellows into the stem color, just to give it a little bit more dimension. I drew the stem with a pencil crayon watercolor in a dark green, and then I painted the stem in with a slightly lighter green, and it makes my stem look a little bit round. And then I added a leaf. However you like to do the sunflower leaf, I went for super simple here, and I added in some different colors to the leaf. So I did the leaf in pencil crayon watercolor, painted over it, and there you go. The last step, and you want to wait till everything on your painting is dry, is you can, and this is totally optional, take a marker or a black pen and draw the seeds. And I like to do them like overlapping petals. It's kind of mindful art for me. I could spend hours working on this. It's very relaxing. You could also skip this part and try with a bigger marker or just leave your sunflower how it was. I just really enjoyed this part. If you ever have a chance to look closely at a sunflower, I encourage you to watch the way that the seeds form, because they are also in a really beautiful petally pattern. All right, and then I did some extra dots around the outside, a little bit like little tiny hairs sticking up from the center of the flower. And I added a little bit more dots. I just did lots and lots of dots in the center and in rings kind of around the outside, just to darken certain spots because it's not entirely flat. The center of a sunflower it's not all one length. So adding some circles with extra dots gave almost like a shadow to them. And there you have it. That is the sunflower, or at least my interpretation of a sunflower. I encourage you to go find some sunflowers or some pictures of sunflowers and use this as a guideline to create your own sunflower. And I would love to see what your sunflower looks like. Just a reminder, let's take a big breath and remind ourselves before you get started. This is just for fun. Creating is just fun, and you are great at it. I would love to see your beautiful creations. You can send them to the email address that's in the description box for this video. Thank you so much for creating with me. I hope you have so much fun. And of course, have a beautiful day.